Good afternoon and hello to everyone who has just joined us or is joining us. Greetings from Ukraine, wonderful. I've just seen in the chat. Very welcome to everyone to this TARSA Thursdays event. My name is Tom Barnes and I'm a sociologist working at Australian Catholic University, and I'm also a member of TARSA, the Australian Sociological Association, which is the main forum for sociology and sociologists in Australia. Before going any further, I'd like to acknowledge that those of us joining today's meeting from places in the colonised territory known as Australia are doing so on Aboriginal land. I'm joining you from the land of the Cammeraygal people of the Eora Nation, land that is part of what is otherwise known as Sydney. I wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that this land was stolen, that this land was never ceded. This meeting is part of an ongoing series which was launched originally in 2020 during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic as a means for students, academics and practitioners of sociology to stay connected. And the series has continued into 2022. This meeting is being recorded and will appear later on our YouTube channel. So for more information about that, please visit TARSA's website, tarsa.org.au. Today we're talking about the future of work, a hot topic, of course, and one brought into further relief by the election of the Albanese Labor government. And, you know, sometimes we can state the obvious, but I did want to say that it is well known that the previous government was not exactly a fan of universities, and nor was it a great champion of the social sciences. So we all want this to change, of course, but will Labor make it so? Well, time will tell, and vis-a-vis today's topic on the future of work, we can also agree that the new government faces many challenges, not least the ongoing effects of the pandemic, the rising cost of living and falling real wages. We are extremely lucky to have three wonderful experts to address three distinct dimensions of this very broad topic. Today, we will hear about the regulation of work in terms of gender inequality and the care economy, in terms of climate change and heat stress in the workplace, and in terms of a reform agenda for Australia's system of collective bargaining. I will introduce each of our speakers as we go, but just before we do get going, a few words on the format of today's meeting. Each of our experts will speak for about 10 minutes, and after we hear from all three of our speakers, there will be a little time at the end for questions. Just to forewarn you, the focus of today will be on our panel of speakers, so there may only be time for a handful of questions, as we will be finishing on time. So apologies in advance if we don't get to your question. And also, we have muted, or we are muting our guests as they enter. But if you haven't been muted, please mute yourself. That would be most welcome. So to our first speaker, Elizabeth Hill is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney. Elizabeth is Deputy Director of the Gender Equality and Working Life Research Initiative, co-convener of the Australian Work and Family Policy Roundtable, and co-convener of the Body at Work project. Elizabeth's research focuses on how economic institutions shape women's paid work, unpaid care, and the care workforce. As an expert on gender and the future of work, Elizabeth will now open our meeting with a discussion about gender inequality and the care economy. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the kind invitation. So I also want to start by acknowledging the land in which I'm sitting on here at the University of Sydney, which is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So I was asked, as Tom said, to address the issue of women in the future of work and the care economy. And given the advertising blurb for the session, I'm going to link this to the policies of the new Labor government and the regulatory challenges that loom as the new government starts to implement its selection platform in this space. So we'll start by highlighting a couple of things that many of you will be familiar with. Okay, so a few facts about the contemporary Australian economy. So firstly, I want to make a strong statement that all the research points to the fact that Australian women are productivity gold. Young women are highly educated and ambitious, and our research at the Australian Women's Working Futures Project shows they expect long and rewarding careers, and that young Australian women talk about their future of work in very similar ways to young men. The second fact I wanted to highlight is that women, as many of us know, have surged into paid employment since the 1980s and increased their participation across the life course. And their participation now reflects a pattern that mirrors the shape of men's. So I want you to hear on this slide, just to note the red line, which is about where we are now, and see how the Nappy Valley, or which demographers call this dip, the Nappy Valley, that's almost all, that's almost being completely ironed out. The third fact I want to highlight is that the future of work is highly feminised. It's in the highly feminised service sectors such as healthcare, human services and education. And these are the sectors in which the majority of projected jobs growth will occur. The fourth fact is on the left-hand side of this slide, which shows that the contemporary Australian economy is a service economy in which 80% of jobs are in the service sector. And with that, moving to the right-hand side, we've seen women's labour force participation reach an historical high at 62.4% in February this year. And yet, even with that, there's a persistent gap between men and women's labour force participation. And much of that is on account of the next slide, which shows very clearly that women have shouldered and continue to shoulder and increasingly shoulder the majority burden of unpaid care and domestic work. So these facts of the Australian economy and labour market were systematically ignored by the previous coalition-led governments. But with the election of the new Albanese Labor government, these facts do appear to be driving newer policy initiatives in the care economy in efforts to redress the undervaluation of feminised sectors and the gender pay gap, and in fixing the pandemic in workplace disrespect that's been illuminated by the Jenkins report and the work of Brittany Higgins, Chanel Contos, Grace Tame, and many others. So Labor appears to understand that Australian women are productivity gold, and that improving women's participation and equality in employment, that's the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the levers that can be pulled to boost national productivity and gender equality in both work and the home. So in my comments, I'm going to focus on Labor's policies around early childhood education and care as the critical policy area to boost women's labour supply and drive gender equality into the future of work. International evidence demonstrates very clearly that where ECEC is available and affordable, women's labour force participation rises. And the converse, Australian evidence shows that expensive and poorly designed ECEC systems are the primary obstacle to women's improved labour force participation, both in terms of the days that they work, the number of hours they work, and the type of work and career progression that is possible. So as a social scientist, it's a huge relief to have a government that's designing its ECEC policy informed by the research evidence. But given the historical development of a marketised and commodified care economy in aged care, early childhood education and the NDIS, the new government's efforts to reform Australia's ECEC policy architecture will not be a quick fix. It will be difficult and challenging. So I think it's fair to say that Labor's ECEC policy initiatives do reflect the best international and Australian evidence about what it's going to take to build a high quality, affordable and accessible ECEC system. Importantly, Labor has positioned ECEC as a critical piece of social infrastructure and economic reform that will drive productivity and deliver improved outcomes for children, and families and build gender equality in paid work. This holistic understanding of the economic and social role of ECEC is research informed and is reflected in Albanese's stated desire to make universal ECEC one of the main legacies of his government. But what does universal mean and how do we get there? In particular, how do we get there, given that 51% of ECEC providers are for-profit providers? And this is the latest data on the structure of the sector in terms of management type from ASEQA, the quality assurance body for ECEC. And I think the other thing to note here is that schools are not allowed to operate as for-profit, while the services that provide care to our youngest and most vulnerable citizens are allowed to be subject to the logic of the profit motive. So lucrative is ECEC as a business that it's labelled a gold asset class in the investment literature and has become a real hotbed of investor activity. The guaranteed Commonwealth subsidy plus the ever-rising value of real estate that houses these centres makes ECEC a sure bet for investors. But it is this feature of our system, the private and often for-profit delivery of Commonwealth subsidised services, that makes the aim of building a national universal system of ECEC extremely challenging. Labor has said they'll charge the Productivity Commission with reviewing the early learning sector with the aim to implement its universal 90% childcare subsidy for all members. That is to think about how Australia could actually move from the current system that prioritises ECEC as a workforce participation measure to a universal system that delivers for all children, no matter what their parents do and no matter where they live. So the goal is well-founded, and the research is really clear that a universal system will deliver the best outcome for children, for families, for women, for society, and for the economy. But how are we going to get there? I really don't know, but I think it will be fascinating to see if and how the Productivity Commission is able to think about this and how it even begins by defining universality. As part of its approach, Labor has also promised to establish an early years strategy that will connect all parts of government delivering services to the 0 to 5-year-olds, and to try and build a whole of government approach that will put children's wellbeing at the centre of policy and improve service delivery. So most of the states in Australia have this kind of a strategy, and the idea is that it will be developed at a federal level. And given the fragmentation of services for our very young citizens, this should achieve some positive outcomes, and I think should be achievable. But the biggest ticket election promise in dollars for the election was Labor's promise to invest an additional $5.4 billion over the next 4 to 5 years to make childcare cheaper, and this is due to start in July 2023. This money is earmarked to increase the maximum childcare subsidy rate to 90% for the first child in families with a household income of less than $530,000. And then the subsidy for second and additional children in care will also be lifted as per the coalition government's changes that were introduced in March. There's also an increased subsidy rate for out of school hours care that's part of the plan. So the aim of this new investment in the childcare subsidy is to deliver cheaper services for 96% of Australian families who use early childhood education and care. The promised increase in the subsidy will reduce the workforce disincentive for women to work and make it more financially beneficial for most women to work an extra day or two, but particularly to increase on 3 days of work. So the change in the subsidy is expected to increase women's labour supply. But for this to work, 2 other things have to be addressed. So we've got this kind of change in policy on the demand side, but we need to think about how that's going to be balanced by provision on the supply side. So the first thing is that the gross price of ECEC services must remain at or around the government's benchmark rate against which the Commonwealth childcare subsidy is set. So it's a very complex system, The childcare subsidy is paid against a government designated benchmark, but providers are still allowed to charge a higher fee, and that is always paid for by the parents. But if the gross price of ECEC goes up, then the effect, obviously, of the increased subsidy will be diluted, and we might not see the impact on women's labour supply that's being designed. So keeping prices in check will be difficult given the structure of our ECEC system. Historically, increases in the subsidy have been inflationary and pushed up the out-of-pocket cost to parents as providers have lifted their fees to gain extra resources that they then use or take as profits. I think what's interesting is that Labor totally understands that dynamic and have said that they will charge the ACCC in this case with the task of designing a price regulation mechanism that will keep a lid on out-of-pocket costs for good and examine the relationship between government funding, fees, profits, and staff salaries. But this is a huge challenge. How tight can government tie receipt of the Commonwealth childcare subsidy by providers to certain conditions of operating, like certain levels of the staff wages, rates, and fees, especially in a sector in which 51% of providers are for-profit providers? But even amongst the not-for-profit providers, regulating prices will be tough in a sector that went into the pandemic without adequate resourcing and has been smashed by the pandemic experience and leaving them really in need of any additional resources that might be available. So this problem, I think, really points very clearly to the broken nature of our ECEC funding model and gets back to the need for a publicly funded universal system of ECEC, just like our schools. But the question here is, how do we make that transformation? The second policy changes on the demand side for ECEC services will need to be, as I said, met on the supply side, because where we've got these increased subsidies, if they can manage the cost pressures, well, then demand will rise. But will the additional centres and will the additional workers actually be available? The low wages of EC workers is the #1 challenge for workforce sustainability in the sector. It was a problem pre-pandemic and it's a complete capital C crisis now. And I guess then the question then is, what are the mechanisms that government has to lift the wages of ECEC workers? The funding model that operates across the care economy means that the federal government is effectively the lead employer in a supply chain of contracted out services. So increased wages for ECEC workers, like others, only will come from increased government funding and changes to the relevant awards. And I'm sure Alison will talk a bit more about this. But there's also the issue of planning and the location of services. The current funding model means that providers locate in areas where they can cover their costs or make a profit. And this has led to acute childcare deserts that sit alongside childcare oases. So the uneven distribution of services is a systemic problem that limits access. But regulating where services are located will be difficult unless government ensures centres can actually cover their costs. So the lesson is that quasi-markets in care do not deliver for children, families, or workers. However, they do deliver for-profit providers and investors. So for gender equality to be part of the future of work in Australia, I would argue that the new Labor government will have to find innovative strategies to unpick these quasi-markets that I've talked about in terms of ECEC, but are also there in the NDIS and in aged care. They have to find ways to unpick these quasi-markets that dominate our care economy and lock in low paid for our feminised care workforce and deliver suboptimal quality and access for families. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Humphrys. Elizabeth Humphrys is a political economist at UTS, University of Technology, Sydney, interested in the impact of economic crisis and climate change on labour and how workplaces can be made safer and more equitable. A member of the UTS Climate Society and Environment Research Centre, Elizabeth leads their research on climate change impacts for workers. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks, Liz, for that great talk. I'll just share my slides. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some research we've been doing on climate change impacts on workers, and I guess focus on the sorts of recommendations we've been making out of our research project at UTS. In a special report or a special section in The Lancet, one of the leading medical journals, as many of you will know, last year, a series of papers called for a increased focus on planning in terms of the climate change impact on people. They argue, those medical professionals, that many excess deaths, in fact the majority, can be prevented if all countries and all communities and all institutions are involved in processes of planning around the impacts of climate change. As you probably know, climate change is having significant impacts already on workers. Heat from rising temperatures is a major threat to safe and decent working conditions, and that's where the focus of our work on climate change is. Workers are increasingly compromised during the hottest months of the year, and almost half the global population is now exposed to high heat episodes, and that includes more than 1 billion workers. The ILO reports that without action to arrest the problem of rising temperatures, uncontrolled climate change impacts will cause damage to infrastructure, disrupt business activity, and destroy jobs and livelihoods on an unprecedented scale, based on a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise by the end of the 21st century, and also on the structures and labour force trends, that 2.2% of total working hours will be lost worldwide. Now, that means a productivity loss of 80 million full-time jobs. Where I guess our research comes in is, rather than to focus on productivity, we take the approach of what does climate change and its impacts already look like for workers today. So in Australia, there's been a 37% increase in excess heat factor over the past 20 years, so that the amount of heat people's bodies while they're working have to absorb. That in temperate zones, which cover the majority of the Australian population, both in the south of WA, across the southern parts of the country and up to Brisbane, health problems and mortality start to increase at what are relatively moderate temperatures, I think, in our minds, of 28 to 30%. Degrees, that should be not percent. In hot environments, there is a significant impact on productivity for quite small amounts of body water loss. And what matters with high heat is not just the relative temperature, but how humid it is. We cool our bodies by sweating. The more humid it is, the more difficult it is to sweat and cool ourselves down. So alongside increased temperatures, increasing humidity, storms and wet seasons also create problems for workers. And the impact's worse if air quality is worse. In Australia, the new government really has a range of things it needs to think about. Obviously, a lot of the media attention and political discussion has been focused on action to address the severity of climate change and to pull back rising temperatures in terms of what we might think of big picture addressing climate change. But there is a need to also address the already here impacts of climate change, an area that's probably had far less sort of public attention. There's a need to address OHS issues, industrial issues arising from climate change. And I guess the question with the new government is, will this provide new possibilities for trying to address some of these problems? Most of you would be familiar with this sort of graph about rising temperatures, but sitting alongside rising temperatures in Australia, we can see the rise of what we call extreme heat events. So it's not just how hot it might be on one particular day, but the more heat waves, the more that there are hot temperatures day after day, people's bodies cope less well as there are further days of hot weather. So accidents at work or individuals not coping with the heat, they may not even necessarily happen on the first very hot day. They may happen in the subsequent days of those heat waves. And that graph there about extreme heat events is really one of the key problems for workers in Australia. Obviously, alongside issues of high heat, we have these changes to weather patterns, flooding, but also bushfires. So Australia's globally experienced one of the greatest increases in fire risk in the last 2 decades, and the Black Summer bushfires of 2019-2020 alone caused greater than 400 excess deaths due to inhalation of smoke and ash, over 4,000 more hospital admissions, and 8 million people were impacted by smoke in Australia. The tangible costs are estimated at about $100 billion, but the intangible ones Deloitte has estimated at $230 billion. In terms of research on the impact of climate change on work, there's really sort of 3 areas that academics have been looking at. The first 2 is where I guess most of the efforts have been around how do we transition from fossil fuel-based economy into renewables, more sustainable forms of production that can impact climate change globally and rising temperatures. The next area has really been around like green jobs, green skills, what will the new economy look like, what will good jobs in that economy look like, and what will happen to the workers who lose work through a wind down of the fossil fuel industry. There's then research obviously on the more direct impacts of labour, and that's where we've been focused at UTS. Now, the reason we started this research was we were thinking about the ways that unions had approached the issue of climate change in general, that really they'd started from a premise that there was a need for unions to educate their workers about climate change, and it was quite a top-down process. And yet the number of people in unions who thought climate change was real and that governments should take more action was really not that different to the general population. So our approach had sort of started from thinking about, well, how could we approach the issue of climate change in a different way in workplaces? And so we've worked with particularly the United Workers Union on thinking about what a ground-up approach to climate change might look like, beginning with the everyday experiences of workers. We have work from the presumption that the labour process is contested, and that includes OHS, that despite the fact that the law and structures around OHS policy making are premised on a mutual interest between labour and capital, that in practice that is not the case. That climate change and the labour process are internally related. It's not a question of climate change coming and acting on workers. It's actually the process of capitalist production that produces climate change from within those structures, and that those structures are already always exploitative. We take a labour-centred approach to climate risk rather than one that's even that the ILO, I think, switches into sometimes, which is really about the financial impacts of climate risk. And a framework that thinks not just about how we need to tackle climate change generally, but how the process of adaptation to climate change needs to be politicised in terms of improving outcomes for labour in what there will be adaptation. We're already locked into some of these changes. We've examined how workers experience and manage high heat conditions in the workplace, what their views on the relationship between climate change and high heat are, and also how COVID-19 impacted in terms of exacerbating high heat, as well as the bushfire season. I just wanted to read a couple of quotes from about what workers told us about how extraordinarily difficult it's been working in recent Australian summers and during COVID-19. So this worker, who's a manufacturing worker, told us it's quite terrible. You drink way more water, so you're forced off the line, which puts pressure on you to work harder, which makes you sweat more and then tires you out. Essentially, it's just an all-round lose situation because you're hot, overheated, stressed, and incredibly sweaty. And stress was a real theme through the research. This document and food cyclist courier told us about another worker he came across. The other cyclist was sweating his head off and then he gave up, literally collapsed in the heat. I think he was riding up a hill. I encouraged him to take a break or slow down and he replied, "I've got to finish this gig, they're tracking me." This worker told us they've got a lot of stuff in writing, say that if it's an extreme heat day, we'll rotate people and everyone will get a 5-minute extra break each hour, but that's just rubbish. It just doesn't happen. You know, they say you can do it, but we just haven't got the manpower to do it. And it's worth pointing out that it's not just the experience of heat, but what happens within the labour process, whether people are allowed to do the very basics of managing the impacts of high heat and climate change, including taking extra breaks, being able to hydrate, or whether they're prevented from taking those or limited in being able to take those very, very basic actions in the workplace. COVID-19 had a massive impact on workers, particularly a lot of indoor workers told us incredibly horrific stories of, limiting how much they drank because they couldn't drink while they were in PPE. There weren't enough extra workers to help them with PPE, help them with increased workloads. Workers like cleaners who would usually have worked in the cooler parts of day being forced to clean multiple times throughout the heat of the day, including play equipment, and no extra resourcing or staff or protection to account for both the impacts to the changes of that work and of needing to wear extra PPE. Some of the key findings from our research about the impacts of climate change on workers, with a particular focus on heat, are that many workers lack access to adequate cooling controls because it's not just outdoor workers who are at risk, but indoor workers who have a lack of cooling controls or who can't do the basics such as rehydrate or take breaks. And just like a sort of, I guess, note on the care economy that Liz is talking about, like some of these workers are like low-paid home care workers, assisting people with disabilities who, and that those clients may even have air conditioning but can't afford to run that air conditioning. And so they're racing between incredibly hot houses, doing physical labour, assisting those people into incredibly hot cars, racing to the next appointment with no ability within that timetabling of their appointments to rehydrate adequately or take extra breaks. In what we'd call externally paced jobs, so that can be that a machine is moving at a certain rate, or it can be you're a food delivery rider whose day is governed by an algorithm, or it could just be the rostering process like I described with home care workers. Workers found it very difficult to protect themselves in high heat. In the big survey we did of the United Workers Union members, and they're across dozens of industries, over 20% in the 12-month period prior to the survey couldn't work at some point because of that high heat. Workers have seen colleagues, although those they care for, faint, have seizures and die, as well as experiencing symptoms like headaches, fatigue, exhaustion themselves. A majority of workers in that survey didn't have or weren't aware if there was a heat management plan in their workplace. The workers who were aware that there were policies said that enforcing those policies was often difficult. One worker talked about how they had fought for many years to gain a policy in their workplace, but nobody knew where the policy was and nobody had the ability to enforce that policy day to day on hot days. And only 2.4% of members had taken workplace action regarding high heat issues. A kind of surprising finding, given the United Workers Union has been one of the unions more likely to be taking industrial action, particularly in the period of COVID, which is when this survey was run. In terms of COVID-19, over 1/3 of workers experienced increased difficulty in managing high heat as a result of those changed working conditions. And in terms of the bushfire period, it was quite clear from the stories that workers told that there were insufficient procedures in place to deal with the smoke and ash emergency. And once the crisis was unfolding, insufficient OHS action was taken by employers. Things like try and wrap a damp cloth around your face and get on with the job. We also asked workers, did they think there was a direct relationship between climate change and how they experienced their job? A majority, 56.2%, said there was a clear relationship in their mind between climate change and their working conditions. Most of these workers that we surveyed had actually been in their jobs for 5 years or more. 33.8% thought it was not impacting and 10% were unsure. For some of them, it was difficult for them to tell whether getting older was the main impact on high heat, and women talked a lot about the impact of menopause and not being able to cope with that in high heat periods. The recommendations that we have made out of our research, and these are in a joint report we published with United Workers Union, and also another joint report we published with the Centre for Future Work, which Alison is the senior economist for. I'll just run through a couple of these. So we recommend that Commonwealth and state governments need to urgently address increasing workplace heat, and this has to have the involvement of workers and their representatives in that process. That whilst current OHS frameworks are supposed to and on paper should facilitate protecting workers, this is not occurring, and that compliance and enforcement is inadequate to deal with the impacts of climate change. That we need sector by sector meetings to formulate sector specific regulatory frameworks, because both individual bodies cope quite differently with heat, but also the needs of particular industries are quite varied and different. We need to abolish the restrictions on bargaining content to make it clear that workers have an unambiguous right to bargain around climate change and its impacts in the workplace. That new frameworks must address the impact on vulnerable workers, including workers with minimal rights and agency in the workplace, and that workers in casual labour hire, on-demand and temporary migrant working arrangements must be afforded greater protections and fair income maintenance if they need to work more slowly or take breaks. And there's a good deal of risk around the question of the pace of work in heat. A recent coronial a couple of years ago in Queensland about a backpacker who died after while fruit picking showed that both they had complained to managers about how hot it was and their ability to get the work done, and that there were both issues of like complying with decent OHS in those circumstances, but also the need that workers felt to continue with their work at a certain pace because of the requirements of the sort of work contract they were involved in. And they're the references. So that's it for my talk. And I guess, possibly there are some more, there is a better opening with the new government to start to tackle some of the issues in terms of climate change impact at work. But I think one problem that that hasn't really been addressed is what I was talking about earlier about the presumption that OHS frameworks are already adequate because there is this obligation on employers to either eradicate or minimise the risks from any OHS risk, but also that we have structures in place and that it is the interest of all parties to protect workers in the OHS process. So we have collaborative working groups and meeting structures, but clearly this is both not working in these circumstances, but also it's based, in my view, on a fallacy that there are shared interests around occupational health and safety between workers. We've only got to think about the sort of messaging around OHS that, you know, all workers are responsible for safety at work, or everybody's responsible in making their workplace safe. But we know in the end, when we look at these workers, workers are actually sometimes prevented from taking action that would protect themselves, even if they know how to protect themselves, by that, by the fact that there is differential power in the workplace, and workers have difficulty asserting control within the structures of the workplace. And that's something that needs to be, I think, tackled head on by workers' organisations and scholars who are working on these sorts of questions. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. And on to our last speaker before we had time, for just a couple of questions. Alison Pennington. Alison is Senior Economist at the Centre for Future Work with the Australia Institute. Alison conducts research on economic issues facing working people, including the future of jobs, skills and training, women's work, collective bargaining and the role of government. Alison is a regular national media commentator and had previous roles in the Commonwealth Department of Finance, public sector unions and public school music teaching. Over to you, Alison. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you all. Sociologists, my favourite people, my favourite economists are sociologists. So we haven't got lots of time. I actually don't have slides, partly because I thought 10 minutes is not enough time to get all the points across through slides, but also because I've just come out of my COVID isolation spell. So you're getting the raw existential thoughts of someone who's been in isolation for a week. I wanted to just quickly brush on the issue of collective bargaining, my favourite topic in the world. And it was, I guess, victim of the small target strategy that the Labor government took to this current election compared to the 2019 platform, where we had a much more expansive, kind of ambitious program to deal with the decline of enterprise bargaining. On this occasion, it's not sort of in the current policy platform. There's a whole bunch of very exciting and interesting things that are, which would broadly look at improving the quality of jobs, dealing with insecure work, lifting historically structural low wages, particularly in feminised sectors. And they have the potential to be quite, make a big difference to bargaining power, which is what I want to point to. But in terms of the actual laws and the structures that facilitate the capacity of workers to come together on the job, raise a serious cost of disagreement with an employer about their wages and be able to get a better outcome. The system that facilitates that is in a serious state of arguably disrepair in its current form. So if we look at what's happened, taking this time to take stock of what's happened over the election campaign, but also the broader pandemic, is that we are seeing, I believe, the unraveling of the standard economic consensus around essentially the lies that have been told to workers through neoclassical, neoliberal type economics, which say things like, if we have lower unemployment will mean that wages will go up. Or one of my favorites is, we just need to focus on productivity increases. And when we increase productivity, this will inherently naturally flow onto wages. I think we've seen the unraveling of that consensus in our mainstream economic institutions and increasingly in the media. And that's parallel with the enormous fiscal role of the state that's been played throughout the crisis, where hundreds of billions of dollars have been ploughed into the global economy and has unravelled a consensus around fiscal discipline. So I think there is that broader piece that's going on. The individualization project in employment relations is also unraveling. The idea that the most efficient and effective way for workers to get better outcomes is to be on individual contracts. In Australia now, we're at the point where individual contracts are the main pay setting mechanism for all employees. That's quite remarkable for a country that has historically defined itself as a collectivist, regulated, egalitarian society. We are now at the point where individual contracts reign supreme, and all of the supposed benefits of that system are also unraveling. So I think the time is ripe to be talking about an ambitious program for multi-employer sectoral bargaining. The design of that, I have some ideas, won't have time to go through them, but it is absolutely, first of all, necessary. We have wages growing at the slowest sustained pace since the Depression. Real wages are down 2% in the last 12 months. Since 1975, productivity has grown at double the pace of wages. And one of the most important indicators of the state of bargaining power and the capacity of workers to fuel an inclusive type of economy is that workers' share of national income is now at a post-war historic low of 46%. Parallel to that is the other trend, which is, of course, the profit share of GDP is at a record high. The quality of jobs has seriously declined. It's collapsed. People don't have the experience of standard employment anymore. It is an insecure one. They don't know if they're going to have pay or income next week. Broader macro factors are pointing us to the direction of collective bargaining reform. We have collapse of business investment, productivity declining or lagging, wages, of course, stagnating. And this is pointing to an economy that has lost its capacity to think in the long term because we have enabled this race to the bottom. And that's especially the case in wages and the labour market. We have an inflation battle going on. I think that's a really important macro factor to take into account, whether the prevailing consensus that's unraveling, whether we would like to point to all the various component factors in inflation at the moment. We can't escape the fact that there is a class dimension to inflation. And the truth of the matter is that the wages have nothing to do with inflation at the moment. In the last quarter, the unit labour price of labour went down in Australia by 2.3%. And that's the second largest decrease in 20 years. That's from Greg Jericho's Guardian piece today. So it's clear that wage labour costs aren't increasing, but inflation is. Then we're talking about a profit price spiral. We're talking about increasing centralisation of corporate power and the capacity to set prices. We're talking about austerity, privatisation, and the increase of costs that comes from government handing over assets to the private sector. And this is the important cost of living stage that's set for collective bargaining reform. So much to say on that broader macro state of things. What's on the table at the moment is, I think public debate is understanding the important role of Fair Work Commission intervening to boost minimum wages. That's a good lever. It's one that we can use. It will reach around 2.2 million workers through the award system. And we definitely, and it's great we're talking about the need for government to fund wage increases in those contracted out private social services that they have, the neoliberal markets of the last few decades. These are good short-term boosting policies, but we need, in order to deal with that fundamental growing bargaining power imbalance, which is fueling all sorts of economic and social woes, we need a complete recalibration of the bargaining power between workers and employers. There are broader economic structural factors in terms of the organisation of businesses that lead us to this point. There's a term called the fissured workplace to talk to the ways that employers are organising in such a way to skirt around current labour regulations. They've been doing it for decades, arguably had from the start of enterprise bargaining. But one I think decent insight into this problem for unions when we talk about enterprise level bargaining, that is coming together at an enterprise level to negotiate wages and conditions, is looking at the explosion in the number of firms by the number of employees that work for them. So this is just one way, statistical way of pointing to this problem of, contracting out, of labour hire, of workers on ABNs. So since 2004, we have had the growth of over 300,000 firms that employ 1 to 4 workers. We've got 20,000 less firms that employ 20 to 199 workers, and over 1,000 less firms employing over 200 workers. At the same time, we've had the explosion of over 200,000 businesses that don't employ people, which is an insight into the growth of the gig economy and other forms of insecure work. If you're not hiring workers, you're not incorporated, then you're probably not really a business. So this is an insight into the joke that is enterprise bargaining in a system with those sorts of trends. There are Fair Work Act reasons why the bargaining system isn't working either. And this gives us an insight into things that we can do to create a new bargaining system. First of all, as I've said, the enterprise fixation doesn't allow workers to organise at the pace and the level that business is able to control their wage. The Fair Work Act, which is rightfully called the Unfair Work Act, it has some of the most incredible stipulations around the ability of unions to access work sites, to undertake very basic bargaining, basic campaigning, membership recruitment. So these restrictions are in the Fair Work Act. The actual bargaining system itself basically depends on the voluntary engagement of employers, rather than one that mandates employers to come to the table when they're required to. So that is not a system that's likely to get ever decent outcomes for workers. Looking at the state of productivity increases, which is basically been workers trading off their award conditions, or they're trading off their trading off their conditions to get basic wage increases over the last few decades. That system shows you that it's basically been one that's been of interest to employers to engage in. We have full legal protection for free riding. So in this context of less and less unionized workers, they are funding a system that has less of them and entirely depends on the funds and operation of those unionized members. We call that free riding. I've got a minute left in my 10, so I'm just going to finish off by saying it's going to be a huge project to rebuild a sectoral bargaining system. I've done some thinking and work around what this means for our award system. What happens in Australia from this point on will be different to what's gone on in New Zealand, which scrapped its award system and had to rebuild a state mandated bargaining system, which it's doing through fair pay agreements. The UK has fair pay agreement platforms, and in the US, they've gone through a different route as well. In Australia, it will be different. We need to look at how to look at creating a multi-employer organic system that empowers workers on the ground to define the bargaining scope, negotiate on the level that employers are organising on. We have to expand the content in agreements to include things like climate change adaptation that was covered in Liz's presentation. We have to look at how do we extend the agreement once there is agreement formed across an occupation, an industry, or a particular role. How do we extend those agreements out through our award system and to new employers that enter the industry? And how do we enforce those agreements? Because the collapse of the union movement has been the collapse of our main compliance tool. And I think that in the neoliberal period, the last few decades, we've just sort of been reeling and scratching our heads, thinking about how can the Fair Work Ombudsman, this toothless tiger, ever fill the gap of grassroots, workplace level compliance systems. That's a big topic, and I think it's a big part of talking about rebuilding a collective bargaining system from here. I'll leave it there for you guys.
Thank you, Alison. And apologies for the very constrained time that we have here today. Now, we do have time just before we finish today's meeting for just a very small handful of questions. I will take 3 questions only. I do apologise in advance for that, but today's event is about the speakers. and listening to what our experts have to say. So I'll take 3 questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will call you. Or if you would like, if you are not comfortable speaking on camera, then you can post a question into the chat. So I'll take our first question here from, apologies for my pronunciation, Olha. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you. I'm Olha Maxim, Ukrainian sociologist, and I would like to thank you cordially for this informative and engaging event. I also work as an extracurricular teacher. I run drawing classes, environmental science classes, and career guidance workshop for high school students. If this recording is available, may I show some of the slides of today's presentations to my students in order to give a concise picture of the labour market in Australia? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that one on behalf of our speakers. The answer is yes. You are absolutely welcome to share the information from this video, which will be online as a YouTube video very shortly. If you want to contact the speakers individually, all of their email addresses are available online. So if you Google each of our 3 speakers and their institution, you'll be able to contact them directly if you want more specific bits of information. So thank you for your question. Do we have a second question for today?
Not.
If we don't, then I'll just indulge and ask one question myself, which is perhaps stating the obvious, but it seems that unions are central to all 3 of our presentations today, and the role for unions and the regulation of unions within our employment relations system or our industrial relations system. So perhaps, I guess to conclude the meeting, could I ask each 3 of our speakers just to say something very brief about one key thing that the new government could do to enhance the role of unions in dealing with a specific subject matter that you've raised today, perhaps starting with you, Elizabeth Hill, talking about the role that unions could play in terms of gender inequality in the care economy, and one particular key reform that we could start with from the new government.
Thanks, Tom. Look, unionisation across the care economy is strong, and in fact, its membership in the highly feminised sectors from where union growth is coming predominantly. So workers in the care economy are very aware of the fact that they can't achieve anything alone and that the union is really important. But the other thing to say is that the structure of our care economy imposes a real roadblock to reform in the wages and conditions, in the setting of wages and conditions. So ECEC workers have been incredibly organised. They are supported by parents. They are supported by the community. There's been a really strong movement under the Big Steps campaign of several years to really claim the value and get that and socialise that understanding. They've won that battle, but we've got a structure, as I said, a funding model around ECEC that means the only institution that can deliver a wage rise is the government through a change in their awards system. And Alison's talked to some of the problems there. I think the problems that Alison's identified are amplified in the care economy. So it'll be interesting to see some leadership around this. It's totally on the Labor Party's agenda. But as I outlined, identifying the problem and speaking about the aim of your election platform is not the same as reaching that outcome. So they've got really challenging work to do that will require the kinds of rethinking and recalibration of our existing IR institutions that Alison's pointed to. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Humphrys, would you like to make a final comment there about the role of unions? I know you addressed this, but just in a minute or so, if you could just say something more about that topic, if you'd like.
In terms of what the government could do to, I guess, allow greater capacity, I guess, for unions to organise would be really to abolish things like the ABCC, the Building Construction Commission, which are politicised body to curtail the abilities in a particular industry, and also increase the legal rights to take industrial action. Australia has a highly restricted system, and it's no accident that strike days are infrequent in many industries. It's not just about the nature of unionisation in those industries, but the legal hurdles that we go through. So I think in terms of government policy, whether they will do that outside of pressure from workers on the ground is a different question, but they could be done quite easily.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And finally, Alison, would you care to nominate what would be your first key reform that Labor government could practically affect?
Abolish or phase out all non-union agreements, which are a legacy of both major parties. They have, on average, 1 percentage point lower wage increases that lock them in for longer periods of time, and increasing unions' role in the process of negotiating genuine agreements in those workplaces and funding and supporting unions to do that process.
Wonderful, thank you. Again, apologies to everyone for not being able to ask more questions, but we did have an hour and we had to cram a lot of information into that hour. I want to thank our speakers, Elizabeth, and Alison, for their wonderful presentations. So much food for thought there. As I raised before, this or an edited version of this meeting will be posted online on the TASA YouTube website as a video for those of you to look at, to review, and to share with friends and colleagues. Thank you again for today's meeting. There will be more TASA Thursdays meetings come up. Please check that out on the TASA website at tasa.org.au. But thank you everyone for attending today, and I hope to see you at future TASA events. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll be ending the meeting